The city is burning. Chaos is everywhere. Riots, panic, disease spreading faster than anyone can contain it. The president has declared a state of emergency, but things are only getting worse. You knew this might happen. You planned for it. Months ago, you bought a cabin in the woods just over the state line, a safe haven far from the madness, stocked with food, water, and supplies. It's your lifeline. All you have to do is get there. You hit the highway, heart pounding, racing toward the state border. But as you approach the line, red and blue lights flash in the distance. A police checkpoint. "Turn around," the officer says, barely looking at you. "Out-of-state plates, no visitors allowed." It sounds like a scene from a dystopian novel, but it's not fiction. During the COVID-19 pandemic, this actually happened. Across the United States, state and county governments set up roadblocks, turning people away, sometimes even from their own property. The government got away with it, but how? Isn't that exactly what the Constitution is supposed to prevent? And here's an even scarier thought. What if the situation got worse? What if you weren't just trying to cross into another state, you wanted to leave the country entirely? To Canada, or Europe, or anywhere else? Could the government stop you? Could they trap you inside the borders of a failing system? These questions go to the very heart of the 14th Amendment, a cornerstone of the Constitution that promises to protect your rights as a citizen, but how far does it actually go? When crisis hits and the rules change, how do your rights hold up? Or do they fall apart, just like the world around you? Can the government prevent travel within the states? Wait, what? You're an American! You're supposed to be able to drive wherever you want. That's, like, part of the deal, isn't it? Land of the free, road trips for all. Except, maybe not. This might sound like a dystopian Netflix series, but for many Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was real. Rhode Island was turning away New Yorkers at the border. Hawaii was quarantining visitors like they were entering another planet, and suddenly, for the first time in modern history, the idea of freedom of movement, something we all take for granted, wasn't guaranteed anymore. But here's the kicker, this wasn't a one-off pandemic thing. Travel restrictions aren't new. Back in the early 1900s, during smallpox outbreaks, states used similar measures to keep people from crossing state lines. And let's not forget the times when the federal government restricted travel for entirely different reasons, like keeping political dissidents from leaving or entering the country during the Red Scare or Cold War. And the scariest part, the legal mechanisms that allowed all of this still exist. Today, right now, under certain circumstances, the government can stop you from crossing state lines, block you from returning to the US, or even prevent you from leaving the country entirely. So here's the big question. Is travel a right or a privilege in the United States? What does the Constitution actually say about it? Ultimately, can the government really stop you from traveling within the country? Think back to the early days of COVID-19. States like Rhode Island set up actual roadblocks. Imagine driving toward the beach, only you get stopped at the border because your license plate said New York. Suddenly, you weren't just a tourist, you were a suspected viral threat. Other states like Florida and Texas didn't block people outright, but they required visitors from high-risk areas to quarantine for 14 days. It was like an episode of Survivor, except instead of competing for $1 million, you were competing for permission to cross a state line. And here's the thing, this wasn't a one-time deal. Historically, states have used travel restrictions during public health crises. In the early 1900s, during smallpox outbreaks, states set up quarantines to stop infected individuals from spreading the disease. Back then, there was no Instagram to complain about it, but you can bet people weren't thrilled. So, is any of this legal? The answer is very lawyerly. It depends. The Constitution doesn't specifically say, "Thou shalt have road trip privileges," but courts have long recognized the right to interstate travel as a fundamental freedom. The Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4 ensures that citizens of one state are entitled to the same rights as citizens of another. In other words, Florida can't treat you like a second-class citizen just because you're from New York. This principle was upheld in the Sands v. Roe 1999, where the Supreme Court ruled that the right to travel is a core aspect of American citizenship. Whether you're moving permanently or just popping in for a visit, the government can't stop you without a really good reason. Here's the curveball. While the right to travel is fundamental, it's not absolute. The government can impose restrictions in the name of public health or safety. During a pandemic, for instance, states can argue that temporary roadblocks, quarantines, or travel bans are necessary to protect their residents. This is where the 10th Amendment steps in. It gives states the power to regulate health, safety, and welfare within their borders. When things hit the fan, states can use this power to justify measures that might otherwise seem unconstitutional. But, and this is a big but, those restrictions have to be narrowly tailored and proportional to the threat. They can't just block everyone from an entire state because they might be a risk. Imagine if Texas banned all Californians from entering because they don't like their driving habits. That wouldn't fly. Here's the bottom line. Under normal circumstances, the government can't stop you from crossing state lines. You can pack your bags and drive from Maine to California without a problem. But in extraordinary situations, like a pandemic or a major public safety crisis, they can, and they have. The real question is whether these measures are justified or if they go too far, infringing on our most basic freedoms. And here's the kicker, state lines are just the beginning. What happens when those restrictions go beyond borders? Could the government stop you from entering the US as a citizen? Or even stop you from leaving the country altogether? Can the government stop you from returning to the US? Imagine this, you're finally living the dream. You're on a vacation in Paris, sipping coffee at a quaint cafe, gazing at the Eiffel Tower and basking in the knowledge that for once, life feels perfect. But then, your phone buzzes. Breaking news, borders are closing, flights are canceled, you race to the airport, ticket in hand, only to face chaos. Lines stretching for miles, airline staff scrambling to answer questions, and an eerie announcement echoing through the terminal. US citizens may face delays returning home. This scenario might feel like something out of a disaster movie, but it's not far from reality. In fact, during the COVID-19 pandemic, thousands of US citizens abroad found themselves in similar predicaments. Airlines were grounded, countries locked down, and when Americans were allowed back, it often wasn't a smooth re-entry. So here's the question, can the US government actually stop you, a citizen, from returning to your own country? The good news is the Constitution has your back. The 14th Amendment clearly states that all US citizens are entitled to the right of citizenship, and at the top of that list is the right to re-enter the United States. No matter what's happened in the world, pandemics, wars, alien invasions, your government can't legally ban you from coming home. But here's a twist. While they can't stop you outright, they can make it really inconvenient. During the pandemic, for example, US citizens returning from high-risk areas weren't just allowed to waltz through customs. Instead, they were funneled through specific airports designated for screening. Imagine landing in Chicago when your final destination was Los Angeles, only to face hours-long lines of health checks, temperature scans, and mountains of paperwork. And if you thought you'd avoid quarantine by booking a quick escape to Florida, think again. Many states required travelers to isolate for weeks upon arrival. So technically, you weren't barred from entry, but let's just say it wasn't exactly a warm welcome. But logistical headaches aside, history shows us that the right to return hasn't always been so straightforward. Take, for example, Japanese American citizens during World War II. Many were forcibly relocated to internment camps within the US, and those who left for various reasons often faced significant hurdles returning home, even though they were American citizens. These barriers weren't about public health or safety, but were instead rooted in fear, prejudice, and government overreach. Fast forward to today, and similar scenarios arise in different contexts. Imagine being abroad during a political crisis, say the fall of Kabul in Afghanistan. The US government worked to evacuate citizens, but the process was chaotic, with some left stranded for weeks. Your right to return may be granted, but how that right is upheld, well, that's where things got murky. Here's the fine print. While your right to return is protected, the government can impose conditions on that return. Public health emergencies like pandemics give them grounds to require quarantines, health screenings, and even proof of vaccination. These conditions must be reasonable and rooted in protecting public safety, but as history shows, what's reasonable can sometimes be a matter of interpretation. So, can the US government prevent you from coming home? Legally, no, but they can put up roadblocks, either intentionally or as a byproduct of logistical chaos. And that raises a bigger question. If returning home can be this complicated, what about leaving the country in the first place? Can the government keep you from hopping on a plane to Canada or catching a cruise to Europe? Alright, imagine this. You've had it with the US. Taxes are high, healthcare costs are wild, and your neighbor's dog still barks at 3 a.m., so you decide it's time to peace out. Maybe you're picturing a cozy cottage in Ireland, a beachside bungalow in Costa Rica, or just anywhere without an HOA. You pack your bags, book the flight, and waltz into the airport ready to leave your worries behind. Then, bam! You're stopped at security. TSA looks at your boarding pass, checks your ID, and someone whispers into a walkie-talkie. A stern-looking officer steps forward and says, "Sorry, you're not going anywhere." Wait, what? How is that even possible? You're an American citizen. Isn't the whole idea of land of the free that you're, free to leave? Well, yes and no. Let's unpack this, because the truth about your right to leave the US is both fascinating and honestly a little alarming. First thing first, does the Constitution explicitly say you can leave the country? Nope. It's not written anywhere. Don't panic yet. Your right to travel internationally is still protected. Kind of. The Fifth Amendment guarantees due process, which courts have interpreted to include the right to travel. That means the government can't just randomly decide to stop you from leaving without a really good reason, and some solid paperwork to back it up. But here's the kicker: international travel isn't technically a right. It's considered a privilege. And that brings us to your passport, that little blue book with the eagle on it. Turns out your passport isn't your property. It's the government's. That's right, it's more like a loaner that Uncle Sam can take back if he doesn't want you jetting off to Cancun. Historically, the US government has stopped people from leaving the country for some, let's call them, interesting reasons. Take the Cold War. Back then, if you so much as sneezed in the direction of Karl Marx, you could forget about getting a passport. The government denied travel documents to anyone suspected of communist sympathies. And it wasn't just hypothetical. Writers, artists, and even regular folks found themselves grounded because someone in DC thought they might be a little too cozy with the Soviets. Fast forward to modern times and we've got Edward Snowden. You know, the guy who leaked classified NSA documents and then decided to chill in Russia. The US revoked his passport while he was mid-escape, effectively stranding him in Moscow. And then there's the no-fly list. Maybe you've heard of it. It's the government's way of saying, we think you're too dangerous to get on a plane and we're not gonna tell you why. People on this list often can't leave the country, and getting off it, well, good luck. It's about as easy as canceling a gym membership. But wait, there are some limits. Before you start panicking that Big Brother is watching your Expedia searches, there are limits to what the government can do. International law, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, protects your freedom of movement. It states that everyone has the right to leave any country, including their own. Of course, the US is a signatory to this declaration, but it's not legally binding. Translation: the government shouldn't stop you from leaving without a really good reason, but if they do, international law might not save you. The bottom line is this: the government doesn't usually stop people from leaving, but if you're on the wrong list, tied up in legal case, or somehow deemed a threat, then they absolutely can. And with passports being government property, all it takes is one revocation to keep you from hopping on that plane to Paris. It's a balancing act between national security and individual freedom, but let's be honest, sometimes it feels less like a balance and more like a teeter-totter where the government is sitting on the heavy end. So the next time you're planning a trip, maybe double check that you're not on any secret lists, and if you're thinking about leaking classified documents or befriending Marxist literature, just know you might need to trade that beach vacation for a staycation. But seriously, this raises a bigger question. How do we, as citizens, ensure our rights are protected while balancing the government's need for security? Because when freedom of movement starts feeling more like freedom with an asterisk, it's worth taking a closer look. Travel isn't just about packing a suitcase, snagging a window seat, and getting a stamp on your passport. It's about something much deeper. Freedom. The freedom to decide where you go, when you go, and how you get there. It's autonomy. It's control over your own life. But here's the uncomfortable truth. History has shown us that these freedoms are never guaranteed. They're protected, yes, but they're also fragile, especially in times of crisis. When the stakes are high, like during pandemics, wars, or moments of political unrest, those protections can suddenly feel more like suggestions. Think about it. A checkpoint at a state line, a revoked passport, a government list with your name on it. These aren't just abstract scenarios. They're real examples of how the balance between individual freedom and collective safety can tilt in ways we don't always expect or agree with. And that's why it matters, because vigilance is the price of freedom. Understanding your rights, questioning government decisions, and paying attention to the fine print of the laws that govern us, well, that's how we ensure that those rights don't just exist in theory, but in practice. What do you think? Should the government ever have the power to restrict travel? If so, where do we draw the line? Is it at safety, public health, national security, or does the idea of any restriction make you feel uneasy? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is a conversation I think we all need to be part of. And I'll catch you next time.